Hey, US history. I know you guys are curious about the Roaring Twenties. You've probably even checked it out on Wikipedia after reading Great Gatsby, and you got to see all these kind of great pictures. Like over here, Josephine Baker. She's sort of like a fascinating figure who lived in France and was a flapper and was a movie star and actually a agent of the French Resistance. There's all of these things that are so exciting, but one of the things I want to focus with you is how bumpy the 20s were compared to what we think they were. You probably have heard of kind of these flappers. Let's take a look.
This dance.
Okay, so that's the flappers. You might have seen images of the Model T Ford. Al Capone seems very exciting, but probably a little more dangerous than you guys think. Um, there he is with his kind of famous scar face. All of these things are part of our pop culture understanding of the Roaring Twenties, but really don't kind of get to what was going on underneath. So here I have some notes. Right here you'll see that there was kind of business as usual for America, consumerism, revolution in technology, mass production became really big, financial speculation. We'll look at that in a second. A more liberal lifestyle, but also more religious fundamentalism. So there becomes this clash happening between kind of all the dramatic shifts that you guys tend to focus in on, but also we have kind of a very a stringent side that kind of creates a backlash. The Great Gatsby is just one tiny, tiny aspect of the 1920s. Additionally, you also have a lot of art movements like the Harlem Renaissance, which we'll look at for a second. The presidents during the 1920s were Coolidge, Harding, and Hoover. They all believed in a laissez-faire economy. Laissez-faire is a French term for hands-off, so tips to Noe on that. It means that basically the government was not going to be as involved on the kind of the itty bitty kind of transactions. And what ended up happening is it created a kind of wild market. If you look through these notes between 1920 and 1929, we have a series of recessions that indicate that the market is going up and down and up and down. And they try and deal with it through a corporate or federal revenue taxes. And they do it where it's very light in the transitions. And basically what it does is encourages a bull market. So everyone's trying to kind of get in on the market. A bull market means an aggressive market. People are trading and everyone wants to get in and make a big profit. It is one of those periods where everyone's kind of going to certain sectors of the market that makes it more volatile. And so you'll see that there's kind of a lot of shifting going on here with tax rates and all of that kind of stuff. There's this bull market gives an appearance of wealth. So people buy more during this time. You have 25% of families owning cars at the beginning of the 20s. By the end, it's more. I think it's in the 30s. And as well as people are moving to the cities to get this profit. What is not being highlighted in a lot of this economic stuff and a lot of this kind of pop culture stuff is that there was a series of dust bowls in the West and people were madly moving to the cities. Additionally, in the South, there was something called the bull weasel that was a bull weevil that was a bug that was getting into the crops. And this creates the former kind of standard of the American economy was agriculture, and it was becoming unstable during this time. And then we have a series of issues where the stock prices rose 39%. Basically what they think is that there was over speculation in the stock market. People were kind of overgoing to one side. And so the Fed tries to fiddle with it a little and it doesn't really work. In the end, the stock market crashes in October 24th. And because almost all of the stock was bought on a margin, which is another way of saying they bought it on credit. So just think of a margin between what you own and what you don't own. And people were buying this without actually having the money. It's almost, they didn't have credit cards down, but it would be like buying everything on a credit card. And then, when everything crashes, having to pay back and you have no money. And so all of this happening in the 20s, this kind of push in culture and everything that we see in this consumerism actually was bought on money that we didn't have, hence the crash. So we'll look at that a little bit more when we get to the Great Depression and how it happens in 1929 and how FDR fixes it, or he just kind of makes it not worsen. So this is kind of what's going on underneath in the economy. The agriculture is volatile due to European markets. Basically, remember, Europe is rebuilding after World War I, and so they're kind of looking to us to be suppliers, and then they don't need us anymore, and so we've overproduced. We have that kind of problem like we did during the Crimean War. Additionally, insects ruin crops in the south, and we have a dust bowl, so agriculture is going up and down. Population, there's a migration of people, particularly African Americans, to cities. So at this point, a lot of people that owned those farms in the South were kicking off their workers and sending them north. At first, it was largely men that went north, and then families followed. Consumerism spikes due to post-war boom in buying with credit. New technologies make life more convenient, thus more free time. It's also important to know that we also decide to isolate ourselves from Europe during this time. So we don't want to buy as much from Europe, although some people will buy things like French goods and whatnot. But that actually helps the economy for a bit, but causes some issues as well. Social issues. African Americans experience an economic boom with steady city jobs, and an arts movement blossoms, which is something actually we talk about in art history a lot, is that art is a sign of the ability to produce art is the sign of having leisure as well as having money to spend on it. And so the jazz age that kind of blossoms from this Harlem Renaissance actually is an indication that African Americans are having more upward mobility. They have the Harlem was a middle class neighborhood in the 1920s, and so all of that kind of creates more development. There's a really great art series by Jacob Lawrence. Now, Jacob Lawrence is not a Harlem Renaissance painter. He actually painted in the 50s and 60s. He got a major Genius grant for to create this series. It's there are I think it's 60 paintings. The number escapes me at the moment. MoMA has half the paintings, and the Phillips collection in DC has the other half. They bought them together because they were so valuable they couldn't. Neither museum could own them on their own. But one of the things that's great for is, even though it's an artist later, he's actually documenting the Great Migration in the 20s that his parents went through. And each of these paintings have like a little commentary explaining what's going on. But one of the things that's really interesting about the way Lawrence does it is he shows that even when people got to the north, things weren't easy. And so in the series, he has the southern portion, which we've talked a lot about what the conditions in the South were like. But he talks a little bit about how there's still this kind of segregationist practice happening in the North. When he says, things were not always easy when people get to the North. So that's something to keep in mind. Additionally, the labor kind of tasks for African Americans, the jobs they were given were often not as nice as the jobs that white people got, or kind of white immigrants could move up through. They would start there, but they had more upward mobility. Here's his last painting, which he's talking about that more and more and more people came. So this kind of constant migration north with the hope of a better future is going on too. So if you want more of it, you can go see on MoMA and Phillips Collection. They have it online. It's kind of cool. I love his graphics. He's one of the most kind of genius artists using color and graphics to kind of create uniform pictures. I want to alert you to the fact that this also creates a backlash. Almost always in history, when one group that has been discriminated against moves up, there's a backlash that happens. So with upward mobility of the Black community, whites respond with an explosion of KKK members. KKK membership like quadruples during the 20s. It then also spikes down during the 40s and 30s. So it's very interesting why during this period of like success and money, everybody sort of kind of still holds on to racism. There was also a lot of anti-Semitism during this time and nativism. So this picture here is of the first talkie. It's called the Jazz Singer. It's very famous. People always put the Jazz Singer as the first talkie, but often they don't show the picture of it. And it has rampant blackface by the guy who did it. And he's a vaudeville singer who comes from minstrel shows. Vaudeville comes out of minstrel. And so blackface was part of it. And we now and contemporary always know that the blackface is racist. But in the 1920s, this was part of a major motion film that everybody watched, and that consumers just took it as part of life. But it's the whole point of blackface is to mock Black people. Usually, the character in blackface is dumbing down, and it's kind of these very racist depictions that are not okay. So basically, you can see that this is part of pop culture, and it's so part of it that nobody questions it. Additionally, I want to bring your attention to Henry Ford's the Model T that I showed you earlier. He was anti-Semitic, and Henry Ford anonymously, we now know that he did it, put in a weekly editorial about Jewish people. He called it The International Jew, the World's Problem. And the series was later published and widely distributed. And it's a huge volume, and it talks about all of the reasons why he believes that the Jewish people are a problem. It fueled anti-Semitism in the United States. Anti-Semitism was not something in the 20th century that was just Germany. The U.S. had a major problem with it, and a lot of very famous people like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh were anti-Semitic. Additionally, there was a paranoia about undesirable immigrants. This does link to anti-Semitism. It also links to the Red Scare and the Bolshevik Revolution that was happening in Russia, as well as kind of conflating all of Eastern Europe and Southern Europe into this concept of possible always communists and socialists. So we have two images here. One is of a political comic of Uncle Sam trying to send back this character is actually supposed to be Russian. The potential of a violent kind of Russian communist bombing things, alien malcontent. He's Uncle Sam's telling Congress that they need to send them back where they came from. So, and notice that there is definitely a racist depiction, as we see in political cartoons, of the immigrant. And so that is alive and well. This was June 6th, 1919, and sort of continues the trend. And they end up creating the Quota Act, which only lets people come from certain countries on large amounts, and some countries such as, Italy, Russia, whatnot, Greece, any of the Eastern kind of Bloc countries come at a much smaller level. Here we have Sacco and Vanzetti, which you guys can look up more about. It's very fascinating. Sacco and Vanzetti were accused of murder. They were anarchists and socialists. So I don't really know how that works together, but they basically, the socialist part is that they were part of labor organizations, but they also were anarchists, and they didn't really believe in kind of the power structure that existed, and they were not apologetic about that. They were Italian immigrants, so it was the most kind of scandalous case of the 20s. It was sensationalized all over the news. They didn't receive a very fair trial, and they were executed. And at the time, people even acknowledged that they were basically executed unfairly because of the fact that they were Italian, and because people assumed, because Americans kind of conflate anarchism with communism and all sorts of things, and they assume that they were there to overthrow things. So that kind of shows you that this anti-immigration thing has a Okay, so these kind of cultural things that you guys have seen before: the Harlem Renaissance, Lost Generation, Jazz Age, New Women, referring to the flappers and women who could vote, fundamentalism versus Darwinism, that's the Scopes trial, the concept of religion, God starting, that the Bible was literally true versus science's interpretation of evolution. We talked about the prohibition, the mob. These are all things that are very exciting. You've read about them, and you can look into them more with our assignment. But all of these things that we get excited about really obscure the more troubling issues underfoot in America. So one of the things I want you to think about as you move through this lesson and think about your radio cast and all the things you're doing is, what are some long-term effects of these issues? Okay, so move on to the next portions of the playlist, and I look forward to seeing what you guys produce.